In
at the
1195,
crossroads of
Emperor
Europe
Isaac
and
II
Asia,
Angelos was seized by his own brother
bathed in
while
the
on a hunting
morning
trip
light,
outside
stood
Constantinople,
the
dragged back to the
magnificent
capital and blinded
imperial
with a hot
city
iron.
of Constantinople.
Blinding in Byzantine political tradition wasn't just torture, it was a technicality. Byzantine law barred the physically disfigured from holding the throne, so blinding a rival wasn't an act of rage, it was paperwork. A clean, bloodless way to disqualify a man from power without technically killing him. Without technically committing the sin the Orthodox Church condemned most severely, the murder of an anointed emperor. That single detail tells you almost everything about how the Byzantine Empire actually functioned for 11 centuries. It wasn't a monarchy sustained by conquest or bloodline reverence, the way people often
The emperor's
imagine it.
decree is clear.
It was a state that had turned the
but the
removal of power
logistics
into a
remain
kind of sacred
challenging.
bureaucracy one,
Indeed,
where the forms had
the
to be
northern
observed
roads
even
are
when the substance was
impassable
pure
this time
ambition.
of year.
The core institutional feature of Byzantium was this. There was no fixed law of succession, and no purely hereditary claim strong enough to override the two things that actually mattered: the support of the army and the blessing of the church. Legitimacy in Constantinople was not inherited. It was performed continuously in front of multiple audiences that each had veto power. An emperor could be born into the purple, quite literally porphyrogenitus, born in the purple chamber of the palace and still be deposed within a year if the church withdrew its sanction or the Varangian Guard decided he'd lost his nerve. This created a political environment where the emperor's title meant far less than the emperor's capacity to keep three constituencies simultaneously convinced of his legitimacy: the military, the clergy, and the aristocratic bureaucracy that actually ran the day-to-day machinery of the state. This structural instability produced Byzantium's most infamous export, the palace intrigue,
The Byzantine
as a governing
Empire,
technology rather than a
a
colorful
beacon
footnote.
of
When your
civilization,
legitimacy depends on perception
centered
across
on the
competing
magnificent
factions rather
figure
than on a
of the
fixed rule of
divinely
inheritance.
appointed
The rational
emperor.
strategy
We
isn't
must
to build
secure
alliances slowly
this
through
position
policy.
by dawn.
It's to control information,
It is a
manage
dangerous
appearances,
gamble,
and eliminate
Commander.
rivals before
The
they can
terrain
consolidate a competing
favors
coalition.
the horseman.
The Byzantine court developed what amounted to an entire profession around this reality: eunuchs, barred by law from ever becoming emperor themselves. Eunuchs became the ideal power brokers precisely because they
This
represented no
section
dynastic
details
threat.
the grain reserves
A eunuch
for the
chamberlain like
northern
Basil Lecapenus
territories.
could effectively run the
It
empire's
seems
administration for
consistent
decades
with the
under
ledgers
multiple
we
emperors,
reviewed last
accumulating enormous real
Your
power,
radiance,
precisely because he
a
was structurally
dispatch from
incapable
the
of ever becoming the
strategos
thing
of
everyone around him was
Anatolicon.
terrified of: a rival claimant.
Let us
The
review
empire
its
had, in
contents.
effect, engineered an entire caste of powerful men whose only path to influence was loyalty and indispensability. Because the alternative path, the throne itself, was permanently close to them. This is a deeper psychological pattern worth naming directly. Byzantine intrigue wasn't a symptom of moral decay, the lazy caricature so often applied to it. It was the predictable output of a system that never solved the fundamental problem the Ottomans would later solve through fratricide, and the Habsburgs would solve through rigid primogeniture. Byzantium tried to have it both ways: dynastic continuity when convenient meritocratic replacement,
Behold,
when the dynasty produced
the
a
Queen
weak
of
or
cities,
unpopular ruler,
Constantinople,
and ambiguity meant
rising
every
with the
transition of
sun,
power was a live
secured
negotiation
by God
rather than a settled
and these
formality.
impenetrable walls.
Fear, in this environment, wasn't a personality trait of unusually paranoid emperors. It was the rational, correctly calibrated response to an environment where the rules genuinely could be rewritten by whoever moved fastest and most decisively. Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian, understood this with unusual clarity, and it's worth noting how her most famous act reveals the entire logic of the system rather than just her own character. During the Nika riots of 532, as mobs threatened to overthrow Justinian and the emperor's own advisors urged him to flee the city, Theodora reportedly told him she would rather die in the purple than live as a fugitive because in Byzantium, once you fled, you had already lost. There was no exile and return narrative available to a deposed Byzantine emperor the way there sometimes was in other traditions. To leave the throne even temporarily was to hand your legitimacy to whoever occupied the palace next. Justinian stayed, crushed the revolt, and reigned for another 3 decades. The lesson embedded in that moment became institutional wisdom. In a system without fixed succession, position isn't just power. Position is the entire argument for your right to rule. The obvious criticism here is easy to anticipate that a state built on this much internal suspicion and periodic bloodletting should have collapsed under its own weight far sooner than it did. And it's worth taking that criticism seriously rather than deflecting it, because the honest answer complicates the popular image of Byzantium as simply decadent or dysfunctional. The same flexibility that produced brutal intrigue also produced remarkable resilience. Because succession wasn't rigidly hereditary, incompetent or catastrophically weak rulers could be, and frequently were, replaced without necessarily destroying the underlying state apparatus. The bureaucracy, the tax system, the diplomatic corps, and the military command structure often persisted intact through violent transitions at the top, because none of those systems depended on any one emperor's personal survival. Compare this to Western European kingdoms of the same era, where a child king or a contested succession could paralyze the entire administrative apparatus for a generation. Byzantium's brutal churn at the very top may be precisely what allowed the empire to outlast Rome's western half by 1,000 years. The comparative pattern extends further than most people expect. Venice, centuries later, built its entire republican system explicitly to avoid the Byzantine trap, the Council of Ten, the elaborate electoral mechanisms for choosing a doge, all designed to prevent exactly the kind of factional palace coup that defined Constantinople. The Venetians studied Byzantine collapse closely as a trading partner and rival who watched the empire's internal convulsions for centuries and built defenses against every mechanism they witnessed. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire that eventually conquered Constantinople in 1453 inherited, almost intact, the same core dilemma, a throne with no fixed rule of inheritance, and solved it through a far more brutal, far more absolute method: eliminate the ambiguity entirely by eliminating the rivals. Byzantium never made that choice. It tolerated the chaos of contested legitimacy for 11 centuries rather than resolve it through Ottoman-style finality, and historians still debate whether that tolerance was a fatal flaw or the empire's quiet, unglamorous secret to survival. What Byzantium ultimately demonstrates is that legitimacy without a fixed foundation doesn't necessarily produce collapse.
The Theodosian walls,
exhausting vigilance distributed across every actor in the system, from the emperor down to the lowest court
stretching
eunuch.
from
Nobody
the
in that
city
palace ever got to stop
the
calculating.
sea.
Not the emperor, who woke each morning uncertain whether last night's ally had already begun negotiating his replacement. Not the general, whose battlefield victories made him indispensable and therefore suspect in the same breath. Not even the empress, who had to weigh every gesture of mercy against the certainty that mercy shown once would be remembered as weakness. Byzantium didn't fail to build stable institutions. It built an institution whose entire stability depended on nobody within it ever feeling stable at all, and against every intuition about what should hold a civilization together. That arrangement lasted longer than almost any empire in human history.